All right, good morning. We are General and Housing Committee. It is Wednesday morning. And we are here today to start up our day. Make sure our tech is all set. We're going to hear today just an update on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process that we started. We passed this bill last year, and there was a process that we put into place. Damian Leonard is here to give us an overview of what that process was from the statutory standpoint. And then we have several witnesses, Virginie Ladish from the International Center of Transitional Justice, who was a very major portion of our work last year. She was, they do this work internationally, and they were able to help us shape this legislation last year. And then we will hear from Karen Tronsgaard Scott and Vanessa. I see you joined us, but I don't know your full name yet because I don't have the agenda in front of me. But we will hear from who are the co-chairs of the selection committee. So I'll find it. So with that, Damian, welcome.
Hey, good morning. For the record, I'm Damian Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the selection process that's going on right now were created by Act 128 last year, created a new Chapter 25 and Title I. And so it's important to understand that this is a multi-year process. Where we're at right now, over the summer, there was a group that met to select the current selection panel. And the reason why there was this two-step process was to essentially insulate the selection panel a little bit from the political and other pressures that would happen if it was a direct appointment from the government to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the selection panel, not the selection panel is being insulated, but the commission itself is being insulated. And the selection panel is that insulation from the government. So instead of having the commission be direct political appointees, they're appointed by the selection panel, which has independence from, for example, the usual appointing authorities, the governor, the speaker, and so forth. So the selection panel, their charge is to appoint the Truth and Reconciliation Commission either by December 31st, which they were not able to do, or the end of March. So what they've essentially done at this point is they've provided notice that they were unable to appoint the commissioners by the end of December. So they have voted to give themselves an extension till the end of March, which the enabling legislation allows them to do. And one thing that they're going to be doing is just reporting to you on why they were unable to make that selection in time and whether there's anything in the law that needs to change to enable them to make their selection. So we did give them a very short time frame to make the selection. If you think about the sort of job search, employment search they're doing, they not only need to stand up their own administrative body, but they need to process applications, conduct job interviews, and find commissioners who are going to be able to do this work for the next 3 years, and who are going to be able to do it well and do it in a manner that is transparent and accomplishes the goals of the commission, which is to begin the process of reconciliation for communities in Vermont who have been historically have suffered from institutional, structural, or systemic discrimination that's either been caused or permitted to happen by state law. or state policies. So it's a big task that we're asking the commission to do. Finding the right commissioners is going to be a challenging task. And so you'll be hearing from them, I believe, after 10 o'clock today. So the commission itself is tasked with reporting back to us 3 years after they're appointed. I'm just scrolling through the law here to get to the dates. I apologize.
And actually, before you get to that,
Yep.
3 years out, can you just review for us the nature of the commission and how we decided to, unlike volunteer boards, which are rife throughout Vermont, we wanted to professionalize the board. Can you just go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so the commissioners are going to be, there will be 3 commissioners. They will be full-time exempt employees of the state. They get a full-time salary. They will have an executive director to assist them. And then they have funding for a small staff and in addition to the executive director. The reason for this is there are multiple reasons for this. One is we're asking them to cover an enormous amount of ground. 2, it's going to be very difficult work. We're asking them to seek out Vermonters who have historically suffered or experienced, whose families have experienced some sort of harm or hurt. And we're asking them to document this and help document ways that we can get to reconciliation. In looking at other truth and reconciliation commissions, those that have been most successful have been those that have devoted the resources to the process. So last year's committee ended up deciding to make the commissioners full-time in order to ensure that they would have the time and energy and the support to fully commit and devote their energies to this process, in addition to having the staff to help them with the process of conducting interviews, scheduling meetings, reviewing the relevant laws, putting together the reports and so forth. Are there additional details, Mr. Chair, that I think I might have left out?
No, I just think that in terms of the structure for people to understand what we really, to put it in a vernacular, we felt that the state could not be the judge, jury, and plaintiffs or defendants in this situation. And so this, as Damien mentioned, we're trying to insulate and create space between the system, which we represent, and this commission, which is trying to do its work independently. And so by appointing the first group of people who were state officials or others, as we'll hear, and then they were allowed to choose this group of the selection panel who will be doing the interviewing for the commissioners. So there's another level there where the commissioners are separated from the system, and then the commissioners will hire the executive director and the staff, and it'll become a quasi nonprofit organization that we will fund to do their work over the next several years. So it was really important through the research that we did and the testimony we took to understand that if the Truth and Reconciliation is going to be able to succeed at all, it needed to be that separated from the influence of the system. And so that was what we tried to structure into the statute. And again, we're in the midst of it. We'll hear an update today about where we are in that process. But it was delicate work to get to that point, and testament to the witnesses that we had to help shape it, and to the patience that we had to show in order to get through it. to this point?
So just to give you a little bit more detail on where we're at, the selection panel was selected at the beginning of the fall. It's 7 members. They were selected by a majority vote of a group that included the executive director of racial equity, the executive director of the Center for Independent Living, an individual selected by the Speaker of the House who couldn't be a current member of the legislature, an individual selected by the Committee on Committees, so the Senate, who couldn't be a current member of the legislature, and an individual appointed by the Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court. So there was this group of 5 appointed by a group that represented the executive branch, the legislature, the judiciary, and then the Center for Independent Living that selected the selection panel of 7. The selection panel of 7, they have authority to hire staff temporarily. They select their own chair, and then they have the authority to hold meetings and so forth in order to conduct their search process for the 3 commissioners. The 3 commissioners, so the selection panel receives just per diem compensation. So they are our classic volunteer panel. And then when they select the 3 commissioners, the 3 commissioners have been given specific duties under the statute. The first is to establish subcommittees that would examine the institutional, structural, and systemic discrimination that's occurred in the state. And those committees would be comprised or developed in consultation with the populations and communities that have experienced that discrimination. They would determine in consultation with those populations and communities, as well as historians, social scientists, experts in restorative justice, and other parties, the scope and objectives of the work to be carried out by those committees. So again, the legislature took a hands-off approach here rather than telling them what they need to look at. We're letting the legislature's goal is to let the populations and communities guide that process of truth seeking and reconciliation. And then the commissioners have to develop and implement a process for those committees to fulfill their objectives. And then they have to work with the committees and the commission staff to carry out the research and the public engagement and other work necessary to fulfill those objectives, to develop a record of historic and ongoing systemic, structural, and institutional discrimination that has occurred or may still be occurring in the state. And then to look at the current status of those populations and communities, and any other work objectives that they've developed to carry those out. And then the next step is really a forward-looking step. It's to work with those committees and the commission staff to identify potential programs and activities that could improve opportunities for members of those populations and communities that have experienced discrimination, or to eliminate disparities that they're still experiencing. And then the next step here is to identify potential educational programs related to the discrimination that they've identified. So to identify opportunities basically for learning to continue. And then to work with the communities and experts in restorative justice and, in the commissioner's discretion, other interested parties to develop basically ways to ensure that their work is open, transparent, inclusive, and meaningful for Vermonters. And so the commissioners, as you can see, have a really large sort of list of duties, and it's going to be demanding in the 3 years that they have to carry this out. In order to enable them to do that, we've given them rulemaking authority. the ability to adopt procedures. They're allowed to maintain a principal office somewhere within the state. They can hold hearings anywhere within the state. They have the authority to consult with experts from the local, national, or international sphere on issues related to discrimination, truth and reconciliation processes, and restorative justice. They're allowed to interview and take statements from individuals regarding their research. They're allowed to study, research, investigate, and report on the impact of state laws and policies on the impacted populations and communities. And if they determine that a particular law or policy caused or permitted some form of discrimination against a particular population or community, regardless of whether it was intentional or unintentional, the commission can propose legislative and administrative action to either the General Assembly or the governor as appropriate to remedy those impacts. They are allowed to enter into cooperative agreements with outside organizations to carry out the provisions. So for example, they could work with the Vermont Law School to do some of their work. They can hire consultants. They can seek grants or funding if they need additional funding beyond what's appropriated. And they can take other actions necessary to carry out the chapter, such as contracting and so forth. Their executive director is basically their chief administrator. So that person will help them administer the implementation of the chapter, assist the commission as necessary, and ensure that they have the resources and staff assistance necessary to carry out their work, and will also help facilitate communication between the commissioner and the affected populations and communities, and hire staff, including researchers and administrative or legal staff necessary to help the commission carry out its duties. And then finally, prepare the budget requests that they present to the legislature each year. The reports, there's an interim report due by January 15th of next year. And then there's a final report due by June 15th of 2026 with a draft report due in January of that year to allow time for public comment and review of the report. The final report has to include a summary of all the comments that the commission receives on the draft report, and a statement of why the commission decided to incorporate or reject any suggestions. The reason that was included was to address concerns that if the commission takes a particular focus on one issue or another, and a particular population or community or members of the community feel like their concerns or their truth wasn't represented, this gives them an opportunity to be included in the report with their comments. And so the effort here is to ensure that to the extent anyone feels left out of the process, they're able to be heard in the final version of the report. And then they have the discretion to, or the right to issue additional reports at their discretion if they feel something, an additional report is necessary. They are provided with access to state records and information, and the state is directed to cooperate to the extent possible and the extent permitted by law. Obviously, there are certain records that are designated confidential by law and may not be able to be shared. And so that's something that the commission's legal counsel and the relevant agency would work out what can and can't be shared. And then records acquired by the agent or the commission that would reveal an individual's identity are required to be kept confidential. And the commission's not allowed to include any personally identifying information in any report that it produces without the express written consent of the individual. And that addresses concerns that some members of the community expressed that their are fears of reprisal or being identified as belonging to a certain group based on historic experiences in that group. And so this leaves it up to the individual as to whether they want to be identified in the final public report or they want their identity kept out of the report. And then the commission can also allow individuals to have, if they're interviewed by the commission, allow the interview to be private, so it doesn't have to occur at a public meeting. Individuals can have a private interview conducted, again, for the same reasons. They may not feel comfortable sharing their story publicly or sharing their grandparents' story or something like that, and they wish to have it be private. And that is the summary there. The initial money appropriated was $750,000. And that covers the fiscal year ending this June 30th. So there will be an additional appropriation request coming. I cannot remember the final amount off the top of my head, but it was, I think over 3 years, we were looking at a few $1 million. The chair may remember better than I. So there will be an annual appropriation, and the commission will be coming in with their executive director to request the additional appropriation, which again adds pressure to the appointment process that's ongoing and you'll be talking about later today. So there may be some need to get money included in the budget as a placeholder pending further clarification of the needs in the spring when the commission.
And that would be in the full budget, not in the budget adjustment.
Yes, it's in the full budget. So it's not something that needs to be done now. It's something that needs to go in the big bill for the end of the session.
Okay. Cool. No, thank you for this summary. It's a simple little bill, obviously, and I appreciate you taking this time. I do want to, and Damien, you can stay right there. I think Virginie Ladish is up next. Virginie, welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. Happy New Year.
It's been a happy New Year, I think. So Virginie, while Representative Parsons, Representative Howard, and I were on this committee last year, the rest of us haven't been we're not on the committee, and so what you're presenting is new to them. They don't have, except for what Damien just gave us, a full context. But I understand, in 20 minutes or so. The key here is to find out to hear from you about what the process was. You were gracious enough to not only help us shape the legislation last year, but to be a part of that initial group of selectors that created the selection panel. And I just wanted to take the time to kind of find out how it went, grade our work, if you will, and let us know what your experience was on that committee.
Great, thank you. And apologies, I'm getting over this cough, so I'll try and hopefully, it won't interrupt me too much.
You'd be right at home here. So.
Yeah, I think everything's going around these days, right? Well, first I wanted to just maybe briefly, since you mentioned that people who weren't on the committee last year might not be so familiar with international truth commissions, just very, very briefly share some of the information that I shared with the committee last year around kind of the tradition or the legacy of international truth and reconciliation commissions. Because I think it's important to understand the spirit in which this commission was established, following in the footsteps of those other commissions, as compared to traditional state commissions. So I think sometimes that term commission confuses people and think it's like any other state commission. But globally, and I think in the case of Vermont, truth commissions have been established in contexts where there have been human rights violations, a disrespect of rights that is so massive or systematic that it can't be handled through the traditional court system. And so these ad hoc commissions have been established as a way of examining what happened, providing a platform for victims to speak, to tell their story. And then for those who now are committed to making a break with that, that past, to have a chance to understand what reforms need to be taken. And I think it's important to highlight that, this approach, this tool gives a flexibility that wouldn't exist in a court of law. In a court of law, there's a statute of limitations, or there's a high standard of evidence. In a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's a non-judicial body. So really the commissioners can make the rules, can put the process in the way that they think will best meet their objectives. So I think it's important to view this as part of a societal reckoning process rather than an inquiry. And like I said, it's not to point fingers necessarily at individuals. It's not necessarily to lead to prosecutions, but it's really to unpack what allowed these violations to happen in our society, in our government, which institutions were responsible, which laws need to be reformed to make sure this doesn't happen again. And then also awareness raising for the general public who's maybe not aware of what happened and its ongoing impact to the present. So that's very, very, very briefly kind of an introduction about when and why you might use a truth commission as opposed to another form of inquiry. Excuse me. Then another thing I want to mention, which Damien already touched on a bit, was the importance of to have the societal reckoning to make sure that the Truth Commission is seen as an independent process that is guided by and for the benefit of the people that this commission is intending to help, to uplift, to recognize, and to acknowledge. And so that's, as Damien explained, that's why the drafters of the bill really spent a lot of time to think about how to make sure this is a government-supported but independently run process. And what we have found in other contexts is that it's extremely important to have an open selection process. So I look forward to hearing more from Karen and Vanessa later on sort of where they are in establishing that process. But part of what's in the legislation is for an open call. So it's not, the commissioners will not be appointed by government officials, but everyone has a chance to apply. There also is a provision for an open interview process and a chance for people from the public to send any concerns or questions they might have about candidates. This was recently done in Australia. They have a state commission being established in the state of Victoria. So they followed also this best practice of international recruitment process for the selection of truth commissioners. And the finalists were posted on a web page with a little information about their background and why they wanted to do this role. And then people from the public had a chance to send any comments, any concerns. It couldn't be anonymous because you want to make sure it's not about defamation of anyone, but there was a private email that the recruitment firm could receive any information about any candidate, either in support or some concerns. And I think that led to, when the commissioners were finally appointed, they were really seen as legitimate and representing a variety of different voices, not the usual suspects that are always appointed to government commissions. So I think that there really was an effort to put that independence, as you explained really well, Chair Stevens. Another important point I think to highlight, and where this is perhaps different from some other commissions, is the importance of encouraging broad public engagement. And this is, I think, also another positive outcome of having an open selection process. By advertising the call for commissioners, by having a public interview process, you hope to get more people knowing and understanding what this commission is setting out to do, and then having them be involved. Because there will be the 3 commissioners who are leading the process, but again, going back to this idea of a societal reckoning, we need all of society to take part in this process, to provide testimony, to be listening and learning from, to be reflecting on, with this information that's coming forward, what do we need to do? How do we turn this into new policy? how do we also change our behaviors as citizens to and residents to be more respectful of each other? So I hope that there's a challenge in a context like the United States, like Australia or Canada, where this commission isn't coming about after a very significant transition or end of conflict. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established after minority apartheid government was had to cede power back to the majority of the population. So it was a momentous occasion for the whole country. The majority had a stake in what was said at the Truth Commission. So everyone was watching it, everyone was listening to it and following its proceedings. In a context like Canada, where there was a Truth Commission, or in Australia, or we've had commissions here in other parts of the United States, there's more of a challenge to draw the general public into this process because we're looking at historical legacies. We're not looking at things that are in the news right now. So that will be, I think, a challenge for the commissioners, but hopefully that awareness raising, that engagement can start now. Then the final point, again, which was already mentioned, but I just want to emphasize how important and how unique and trailblazing what you all are doing in Vermont is. In Maryland, the state that I'm a resident of, there is a Truth Commission looking at lynchings, but it was established, it uses the language of international Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, but was established very much like a typical state commission. So appointed commissioners, there's 18, no secretariat and no funding. So it's been very hard for them to do their work. Given the mandate, the burden of this mandate and the importance of this work. So that's a point, globally, Truth Commissioners are paid, it's a full-time job, it's a very seen as a very prestigious and very challenging job. Again, a point that was already made, but I just think it's important to really distinguish this because maybe some constituents might say, I served on a state commission and I was a volunteer. Why are these people getting paid? And really to be able to explain, this isn't a typical state commission. This is really, it's borrowing from the international tradition of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that are meant to help support a societal reckoning and make us a more just and inclusive society. And then one final point is that it's also really important to note this commission is the beginning, not an end. Even the best, most well-resourced, well-run Truth Commission cannot achieve reconciliation in a year or 2 or 3. I often think of reconciliation similar to democracy. We never attain it. It's something we continually strive towards. And I think the work of a commission is successful if it's able to lay a really strong foundation for the ongoing work of working towards repair, redress, and reconciliation. So people have the information, have the knowledge, and there's a sort of a roadmap of steps that need to be taken that will need to be continually reevaluated as things change and come up. So with that, that's sort of just a general overview of sort of this type of commission and what it's hoping to achieve, drawing from global examples. Now, as Rep. Stevens mentioned, I was one of the 5 members of this appointment committee tasked with selecting the 7 commissioners, 2 of which are selection members, 2 of which are here. And so you want me to share some reflections. I think it was, I think that was an added level of separation between the state and the selection panel. In other contexts that we've worked, generally the legislative body named the 5 people who would then appoint, who would be the selectors. And I think it was interesting and I think a positive step as a way of starting to really think about what this mandate means for Vermont, starting to put the word out. The 5 of us really made a lot of efforts to try and go beyond the people who always sit on commissions or are always called to do this, which was challenging. And I think something else that I found, interesting, that there was as you mentioned, Chair Stevens, there was a real effort on the part of the drafters of the bill to not dictate exactly what had to be done, but to really leave space for those who would be leading the process to design it. And I think it's an interesting shift in mentality, because several people that we reached out to see if they would be willing and interested in serving on the selection panel had a lot of questions about how this process would run, how much time it would take. And our answers was, well, it's up to you. It kind of depends. We don't know. And I think that's, human nature in some ways, especially if you're trying to decide on a time commitment, can you take this on or not? You sometimes it's helpful to have really structured guidelines. But I think, and here I'll be really interested to hear from Karen and Vanessa how it's working. This idea was really to say it's really in your hands. This isn't a fake or tokenistic way of involving people. It's really putting the decision-making power in the hands of those who, have worked with these populations or have worked on social justice issues in Vermont and have some level of independence from government. Excuse me. So I think, for me as a non-resident in Vermont, it was a really rich and interesting process. And I got to have phone calls with really great people. I think, there is in some circles, some mistrust of how genuine is this effort? How, is it another effort just to say, okay, this is reconciliation, this is how you have to do it? I spent a lot of time explaining, like, no, there's a real genuine desire on the part of the government, the state level government, to make this meaningful, to make this led by and for those most impacted. So I think hopefully that message is starting to be well received, and that in the implementation of this process, people will see, okay, this is something different. And this is something, as a resident in Vermont, it's up to me to make it my own, to contribute to it, to help shape it. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the process or other truth commissions.
Questions? So we had, we also had testimony from Maine. Maine had again, every commission is unique. I think it has elements that are taken from others. In fact, we still have the books from what were provided to us from ICTJ. So if anyone is interested in seeing some of the background work that we utilized, some of the legalese that we utilized, that but as close as we can get was Maine, more than a few years ago now. But it was also an unfunded process that had to do with appointments, but it also had that kind of independence wrapped around it, where the people who, for instance, when there were, and it was specifically about indigenous issues. Maine has several federally recognized tribes, many unrecognized tribes or state recognized tribes. We don't have any federally recognized tribes. But it was a labor of love that was kind of approved by the state. I mean, the Secretary of State at the time sat on that commission, but it was really, they had to scramble for funds as well. And I believe North Carolina has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, California on a couple of different issues, including similar to what we did in our apology, which was the eugenics movement. And so, again, it's a lot of that information is over here. But Regina, I think what was interesting that you just mentioned was how, when you reached out to people, how they reacted. Like, one of the things that we tried to avoid was it was to rely on the usual suspects, someone who knows the system, who knows how our system works. And so the first questions were, how much time is it going to take? I was just wondering if you could speak more to, I don't know if it's to people's reactions or to your work in terms of helping us through, helping people internationally through this process, because it is different in terms of what were the expectations, and how did you bridge that gap between somebody asking for something tangible, time, to you saying it could take whatever time it takes.
Yeah, I think it helped to emphasize some of the points I just shared with you all, that this is something different, and it has been done, in the United States, as you mentioned, and globally, but it's not what they're used to. And so trying to really suspend any preconceived notions people might have about this process. And then really, some people also said, oh, a panel to select a panel to select a panel. That sounds like a lot of government bureaucracy. And, almost like some people cynically thought, oh, this is a way of avoiding doing the work. And I said, no, really, this is meant to put some space and some distance between the government and the issues. And again, explaining that globally, some of the best practices show that it's really important to have an open, independent selection process, and this was the effort that is underway in Vermont. And I think, just sort of taking people's questions. I think the most effective was just pick up the phone and have a conversation with them to work through any questions and then share these responses. And then I think after kind of explaining it and talking to people, people were usually very enthusiastic, supportive. Then it was a matter of whether or not they had the time, just given full-time jobs and other commitments. But I also will say, some people that we reached out to right away said, yes, sign me up. I'm really excited and eager to support this process. So overall, some good reception, but it was also, as I called people to get names, it was some of that reluctance. But I think I really just tried to urge people to come at this with an open mind, give the state a chance to prove that it's got good intentions, but also recognizing that there's a reason for distrust. There's a reason for doubt, and that's understandable, and that will be there. And I think for the commission to, recognize that, not be upset when people say, okay, this is just another state thing to kind of make you all feel better. It's like, no, this is really our process, and we want to make it important and legitimate and valuable, and you have a role in that. And I think that's also the biggest thing that's different. It's not predetermined. It's not meant to be run by the government. It's really meant to be run by those people it's intended to serve. And so that's also another point I would say to people is, of course, now, we were tasked with recruiting the 7 selection panel members, then there's the 3 commissioners, but beyond that, there's many, many more ways to get involved in the process. As Damien mentioned, there's a provision for them to have a small staff, but even if you aren't formally engaging with the commission, showing up, listening, talking to your neighbors about the process, asking them about it, having discussion groups. What does this process mean for Vermont and how we interact with each other? There's many, many ways to be engaged to make it a meaningful process. So I hope Vermonters will take up that role and that responsibility.
Last question for me before we take a break, Regina. So we're not behind schedule. I think we all anticipated that December 31st was a pretty aggressive time frame. Our fiscal year started July 1. Where did the lag? It sounds like the lag for me, for you, came from having to take the time to actually explain that people weren't going to intuitively know what you were asking them to do. Should we have built in March 31st as a more realistic date in the first place?
Yeah, I think I think it was good to have a shorter, more immediate timeline, and then the possibility of farther away. So our group was appointed a month after after legislation said it should be appointed, right? So we lost a month from the start. And then I think what took us perhaps more time than we anticipated was we were tasked with appointing 7 people. We kind of needed to know who said yes before moving on to others, because we wanted to be cognizant of the balance
Sure.
of that panel. And so it's not like you can just go out and at the same time reach out to 7 people and it's done. You need to say, okay, if this person says yes, that's great, then we want to go to this person. We were looking for balance on gender, race, age, geographic distribution. So a lot of different factors. And I think that is what took longer. And then also, I think, yes, some of that distrust or uncertainty took some time to talk through. But I think, yeah, so I think it was good to have the 2 deadlines. And as you say, I think once we were appointed a month late, we really tried to get everything done by mid-October. But then there just some delays happened. And I think knowing that we were trying to help the selection panel meet their deadline by December pushed us to work a little faster. So yeah, I think having that second deadline was very good foresight. And I think it's hopefully both Karen and Vanessa feel that's enough time. I don't know. We'll look forward to hearing from them.
We'll hear from them in just a few minutes. So thank you. Please stay on the line if you'd like to hear what they have to say. Committee, we're going to take a break now. I'm going to mute. Are we staying on?
The live stream will end.
Okay. So then we can, if you want to, so we're going to go on mute